The Force is old and full of shadows.
The needle was cold. That was the first thing Anakin noticed. Not the smell of the slave quarters, not the distant thunder of engines warming up on the far side of Mos Espa, not even the sound of his mother humming somewhere behind the partition wall. Just the cold of the needle, and the specific practiced stillness he had to hold inside himself while it found his vein. He was 9 years old. In every way that the galaxy could measure, he was 9 years old. Hold. The word wasn't spoken. It lived deeper than thought, in the place where breathing happened. The constant, almost geological pressure of keeping the mask in place. He applied it to himself the way a man might press a cloth against a wound he'd stopped thinking about. The motion so familiar it had become invisible. The medic assigned to Watto's property inventory was a tired-looking Duros with lavender skin gone gray around the temples. He didn't look at Anakin's face while he worked. He looked at his datapad, at the vial filling with dark blood. At the door, anywhere that wasn't the eyes of a child. Anakin was grateful for that. It was easier when they didn't look at the eyes. "Hold still," the Duros said, not unkindly. "I am," Anakin said. He had been awake since the 3rd hour of the Tatooine night, sitting cross-legged on his sleeping mat in the dark, while Shmi breathed steadily on the other side of the room. He had not meditated. Meditation in the traditional Jedi sense was too risky. Stillness of the mind was precisely the wrong direction, since a still mind opened like a window and let the Force pour through it. What he did instead was something without a name, something he'd invented across years of living inside a body that wanted to sing at maximum volume. He thought of it, privately, as narrowing. He narrowed himself. He found the edges of what he was, and pressed them inward, until they touched something that felt almost like silence. Not emptiness he couldn't sustain, not with everything he carried, but pressure, a hand closing around a light source, a deep breath held at the bottom of the lungs where nobody could see the chest move. He was very, very good at it. He'd had 19 years of practice in another life, and 4 more in this one. And the only difference between the two was that the first life had ended at the edge of his son's lightsaber, and the second one had started screaming in a Tatooine slave quarter at what he now understood had been entirely the wrong moment. Watto had ordered the test with 0 sentimentality. Quarterly property inventory, the little Toydarian had said, hovering just inside the doorway with his wings making that wet mechanical sound Anakin had always despised. All units, blood panel and biometric. New regulation from the Commerce Guild, something about resale valuation standards, nothing for you to concern yourself with, boy. Anakin had nodded and said, yes, Watto. He'd gone back to the hyperdrive coupling he was calibrating and waited until Watto's wings carried the sound of them out of the shop before he closed his eyes for precisely 4 seconds. Blood panel. In his other life, Qui-Gon Jinn had run this same test and held up a datapad reading that had made an old Jedi Master weep, quietly in private. Later, Anakin had only learned that detail years afterward, from Obi-Wan, who had said it the way people say things they are not quite sure they should be saying. He wept because he recognized what you were, and he wept because he knew what that meant for you. The midi-chlorian count would not be a problem. He had spent 3 weeks preparing. The Duros sealed the vial and labeled it with a stylus. Anakin watched the label go on. Lot 42 Skywalker, A, 9 standard years, humanoid male, and felt nothing except the low, continuous hum of maintenance that keeping the narrowing required. There was a specific component of what he did that went beyond presence cloaking, beyond making himself feel quiet and dim and unremarkable to Force-sensitive observers. That part was almost easy. He had enough old soul discipline to muffle his aura down to something that felt, from the outside, like a slightly gifted amateur, a kid with fast hands and lucky instincts, nothing more. The harder part was the blood. He had no better term for it than slowing. It was not something any text he had ever read described explicitly, and the closest he had come to understanding it was a conversation he'd never actually had, a conversation he sometimes imagined having with the ghost of his older self, the version of him sealed inside black armor, teaching the version of him sealed inside a child's skin, the thing neither of them had ever been formally taught. You find the hum of them, the imagined older self said, the midi-chlorians. You find the hum, and you turn it down the way you'd turn down a lamp. Not out, just down. Low enough that an instrument reads ordinary. Low enough to be nobody. The cost was heat. a constant interior fever that sat just below the threshold of visible symptoms, a slow burn he banked every night and rekindled every morning. Shmi thought he ran warm because of Tatooine summers. He let her think that. All done, the Duro said. He pressed a small adhesive patch over the puncture and made a note on his datapad. Anakin looked at the vial of his own blood sitting in the collection rack and thought, that is the most carefully constructed lie in this quadrant, and no one in this room knows it exists. You can go, the Duro said. Send your mother in. She's not... Anakin stopped. She's the adult in my household, yes. I'll get her. He slid off the examination bench and walked to the door without hurrying. 9 years old, moved at a certain pace. He had learned to inhabit the pace completely, not a performance exactly, more an ongoing commitment to the shape of the story he was telling. A child who had been born with fast hands on a desert world, and a talent for fixing things, and no father, and too much imagination, and not quite enough luck. That was the story. Every detail of how he moved, how he spoke, how he reacted to pain and heat and boredom had to serve the story, because the story was the only thing standing between him and a destiny he refused to repeat. He found Shmi at the courtyard gate, standing in the early light with her hands folded and her face arranged into the specific expression she wore when she was afraid, but had decided not to be afraid out loud. It was an expression he had spent 9 years memorizing, and the past 45 years missing. Seeing it still opened something in him he had no safe place to put. They're ready for you, he said. She touched his face, a quick press of her thumb to his cheek, the same gesture she'd used to stop his crying when he was very small, and that she'd kept using long after he stopped crying in front of people. How was it? Fine, he said. Cold needle. Bored Duros. Nothing. She studied his eyes for a moment. Shmi Skywalker was not force-sensitive by any measurable standard, and yet she had always been able to look at him and see something that shouldn't have been visible. He had thought, in his first life, that it was simply what mothers did. Now he was less certain. Now he thought she might simply be the single person in the galaxy to whom the mask had never entirely applied. Nothing, she repeated, and the word was not quite a question. Nothing, he confirmed, and held her gaze and kept the narrowing steady, and did not let her see the depth of the relief moving through him like a tide, because the needle was done, and the blood was in the vial, and the lie was intact. And for one more day, in one more collection of Watto's inventory, Anakin Skywalker was nobody. She nodded once, patted his cheek, and walked past him toward the door. He turned to face the open courtyard and the climbing sun, and in the privacy of a moment that belonged entirely to him, he exhaled. Just a slave boy, just a wrench in a junk shop, just nobody. Good. Qui-Gon Jinn arrived on a market day toward the end of the trading week. Anakin knew this was not how the Jedi Master thought of his own arrival. Jedi did not organize their lives around the Tatooine market calendar. Did not think in terms of which day the water merchants came, and which day Watto let the shop boys finish an hour early. But Anakin did, because Anakin had been living inside the rhythms of Mos Espa for 4 years, and knew that the late-week market days meant the loading docks on the far side of the Mos Espa Grand Arena were busy enough to cover the sound of a T-14 hyperdrive, running a diagnostic, and that Watto would be distracted haggling over shipping manifests until at least the 14th hour, and that the window between the 13th and 14th hour was the quietest 60 minutes the shop ever produced. He had the hyperdrive coupler Qui-Gon needed finished by the 12th hour and 40 minutes. He had been finished with it since the previous afternoon. The first time he saw the man, he felt nothing that surprised him, which was itself the surprise. He had expected grief. He had expected the specific. Chest-collapsing weight of seeing a face he had watched die in his own arms at the age of 13. A face he had then spent 30 years avoiding thinking about too precisely. Because thinking about it opened doors that led to other losses, and the losses had a way of building pressure inside the narrowing that was dangerous to manage in public. He had expected, at minimum, to need a moment. Instead, he felt something closer to the sensation of finally putting down a heavy bag. Qui-Gon moved through Mos Espa with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who trusted the Force to show him what he needed, and was in no particular rush to argue with it. He was taller than Anakin had remembered. The mind, it turned out, compressed the dead into smaller versions of themselves, grief working like a lens the wrong way around. Beside him, the girl from Naboo moved with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent time learning to be unobtrusive and had not quite mastered it yet. Her eyes were too alert, taking in too much, and she stood too straight for anyone's handmaiden. He knew exactly who she was. He kept his face arranged into the open, slightly squinting expression of a Tatooine child watching off-worlders stumble through the sand, and went back to sweeping the front step. The sandstorm came when the outline said it would. He had not arranged this. He was not yet willing to spend that kind of force capital on atmospheric manipulation, and besides, Tatooine's weather was its own chaos system that needed no help. He brought them inside. He made the offer his mother would have made regardless, because Shmi Skywalker's hospitality was not a performance and not a calculation. It was simply who she was, unchanged by context, consistent as gravity. Dinner, the table. 5 people in a small room while sand threw itself against the exterior walls with the flat sound of static. He sat across from Padmé and did not look at her any longer than a child without history would look at a pretty girl from somewhere else. Curious, briefly, then back to his food, then back to R2, who was being insufferable in the corner and deserved the social acknowledgement. He was aware of the specific and treacherous warmth that looking at her too long would produce, and he was more aware that Qui-Gon Jinn, whatever his other qualities, was not a stupid man. Under the table, he kept the narrowing tight. Emotion was the leak point. He had 4 years of understanding this, and the understanding had been purchased through close calls that still made him cold to recall. The first year, 6 months in, Shmi had burned her hand on a heating coil, and he had felt the pain of it at a distance, through some maternal bond the Force had apparently decided to establish without consulting him. And his aura had blazed so hot for a half-second that the neighbor's tuka-cat had bolted from its sleeping spot on their shared wall and not come back for 3 days. He had learned from that. He had learned to recognize the feeling of emotion becoming pressure and to redirect it sideways into the narrowing rather than letting it push outward. He was careful with Padmé, and he was careful with Qui-Gon, and he ate his dinner. Later, after when Qui-Gon asked him about the pod, and he had known the question was coming, had known it for 4 years with the patient, tired certainty of a man rewatching a holo he'd already memorized, Anakin told him the truth dressed in the costume of a child's accidental honesty. "I built her myself," he said about the racer, which was true. "From what?" Qui-Gon asked, which was the question Anakin had been waiting for. "Pieces," Anakin said, and grinned the way a child grins at a word that substitutes for a longer explanation, and Qui-Gon smiled back, and they both accepted the simplification for different reasons. The bet happened the way it had always happened. Watto's greed, Qui-Gon's patience. The pod is the stake, the specific mechanical series of events that ended with a freed boy and a freed mother and a ship that needed a part it would now receive for nothing. The architecture of it had always been elegant. He had hated it in the remembering, for being so contingent, so many things that could have broken wrong. But standing inside it again, he understood something he hadn't from the outside. The bet was never contingent, not because the Force was arranging outcomes, but because Qui-Gon Jinn was extraordinarily good at reading people, and Watto's greed was not a variable. It was a constant, and the only question had ever been finding the right fulcrum. He had won the race before. He knew how to win this one, which meant he knew precisely how not to win it too easily. What the outline of events did not include, because no account of it existed anywhere in the galaxy's memory, was what happened the morning before the race. In the hour before first light, when Shmi woke to find her son sitting at the workbench with a half-assembled control yoke in his lap and no lamp lit. "Ani," she said in the voice she reserved for the dark hours. "I couldn't sleep," he said. She sat across from him in the dark and did not ask him to explain it, which was one of the 10,000 things he loved about her that had no adequate language. After a while she said, "You're afraid?" He considered the word. It was not inaccurate. Not of the race. He had raced this course before, inside a different skull, and the only fear he was capable of regarding the actual flying was the disciplined, managed fear of making an obvious move look accidental. What he was afraid of was adjacent to the race. It was everything the race opened. "I'm afraid of after," he said, which was as truthful as he was willing to be. She was quiet for a long time. The sand moved against the walls. The heating unit ticked. "After is always the part we can't see," Shmi said at last. "It doesn't stop being after. It just becomes now, eventually." He looked at her in the dark and thought about a moisture farm outside Anchorhead and a figure hanging and his own hands arriving too late, and the way rage had felt like falling into something that wanted to keep him. And he thought, not this time. Not you. Never again. I know, he said. She reached across the workbench and covered his hands with both of hers, and he let himself have the warmth of it without the narrowing in the way, just for a few seconds in the safe dark. The race day came with the particular quality of Tatooine mornings that made everything look like it had been arranged specifically to be witnessed, the light arriving sideways, the shadows long and deliberate, the twin suns not yet high enough to have forgotten mercy. He won by half a second with a scorched left stabilizer and Sebulba's wreckage decorating 200 meters of canyon floor behind him. The crowd made a sound like weather. His mother stood at the finish line barrier with her hands pressed against her mouth and her eyes closed. And when she opened them and found him climbing out of the cockpit, in one piece, she crossed the distance between them in 12 fast steps and held on. He let her hold on. He let her feel all of it, the terror, the relief, the disbelieving joy, because she had earned all of it and he was not going to be efficient about this. Over her shoulder, he saw Qui-Gon watching with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally moved, and behind the master, Padmé watching the two of them with an expression Anakin recognized from another life, as the look she wore when something reached past all her careful composure and touched her anyway. He tucked his face against his mother's shoulder and closed his eyes. One step. Just this one step. The rest comes after. The twin suns pressed down on all of them like a blessing no one had asked for, and everyone needed. Coruscant from above looked like a wound that had learned to call itself a city. Anakin pressed his forehead against the cold, transparent steel of the transport viewport and watched the planet resolve from abstraction into detail, the grid of light, the canyon streets, the atmospheric traffic moving in columns so organized they looked mechanical even from altitude. He had spent years on this planet. He had bled on it, governed from it, hunted people across it, in the dark. He knew its smell, recycled air and ozone, and the particular metallic sweetness of a civilization that had been burning its own exhaust for so long, it had stopped noticing. He let himself look for exactly the amount of time a child who had never left a desert world would look, which was to say, completely, openly, without the self-conscious modulation of a man who knew too much. Beside him, Qui-Gon stood with his hands clasped behind his back and said nothing, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that Qui-Gon had always been able to produce without effort, a quality Anakin had not appreciated at 13, and was now, at 9, able to recognize as the rarest social skill in any room. "It's bigger than I imagined," Anakin said. "Most things are," Qui-Gon replied, "and smaller at the same time." Anakin considered this and said, "That's either very wise or not quite a sentence." Qui-Gon's mouth moved. It was almost a smile. The temple was the same. Of course it was the same. He was the one who had changed. Not the stone, not the towers. Not the particular quality of light in the high halls that fell through the windows and long diagonal bars, and made everything look like it was in the process of being slowly revealed. He walked through the entrance corridor with Qui-Gon's hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and kept his eyes doing the work of wonder, while the rest of him performed the harder labor of remaining unremarkable. Padawans passed in pairs. A group of initiates moved single file behind an instructor, their faces carrying the focused, slightly anxious expression of children who had been told today was important. He recognized none of them specifically, which was a relief. The faces he did recognize in this building were senior enough to be in meetings, not hallways, and he was not yet expected anywhere that mattered. He had time. He had learned to be very patient with time. The anteroom outside the High Council chamber smelled like polished stone and old decisions. He sat on the bench Qui-Gon indicated and folded his hands in his lap and breathed at the rate appropriate to a child who was nervous but holding it together, which required almost no acting because the body he inhabited was 9 years old, and the body understood something the mind was managing, that this room was where things became official. He had stood in this chamber once before, at 13, in a life that had ended badly, and the council had told him he would be trained because Qui-Gon was dead, and Obi-Wan had made a promise over a dying man. He had not been chosen. He had been inherited. The distinction had mattered more than he had admitted for longer than he'd admit now. Qui-Gon came back out after 22 minutes. His face communicated nothing and everything, in the way of a man who had learned to communicate through quality of stillness. "They'll see you," he said. 12 faces. A circle of chairs, arranged in a configuration designed. Anakin had always privately thought to make the person standing in the center feel simultaneously observed from all directions and unable to fix their attention usefully on any one point. He stood in the center and looked slightly past Yoda's ears at the mid-distance and answered what he was asked. Mace Windu's gaze had the quality of a structural assessment. He looked at Anakin the way engineers looked at load-bearing walls, not with hostility, but with a specific professional suspicion of anything that hadn't yet been tested. "Begun, the reading has," Yoda said, "but lo, the count is. Nothing extraordinary the panels show." "No, Master," Anakin said. "I don't think I'm extraordinary." A pause moved through the room. Not long, 3, 4 seconds. But council pauses had their own weight, and he felt it press against the narrowing like a hand testing a door. Ki-Adi-Mundi leaned forward slightly. "You demonstrate some sensitivity, boy. Some. Qui-Gon believes this to be greater than our instruments confirm." "Master Qui-Gon is generous," Anakin said. Mace's eyes sharpened a fraction. It was the answer of a child with enough self-possession to offer deflection, and self-possession in children read differently to different watchers. To some as maturity, to others as a flag. "Fear," Yoda said abruptly. "What do you fear, young one?" He had prepared for this question. He had prepared for it with the meticulous thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what it was designed to surface, and his preparation was this. He answered it with the truth. Not all of the truth. One vein of it, shallow enough to be safe, deep enough to be real. "Losing my mother," he said. She's still there, on Tatooine. I didn't get to." He stopped, let the breath catch the way it genuinely wanted to. "I didn't get to say anything useful before we left." Yoda's ears lowered, not dramatically, just a centimeter, the smallest available unit of Yoda sympathy. "Natural, this is. Carried far from home you have been. Clouded his future is," said a council member whose name Anakin declined to remember, because remembering it made the grief sharper. "Attachment clouds the reading." "Yes," Anakin agreed, because agreeing cost nothing, and because the statement was so true from a certain angle that he could say it without it being a lie. Mace Windu spoke with the precise, even delivery of a man communicating a decision that had been made before the conversation began. "You are 9 years old," he said, "past the age of typical initiation by 4 years. The count, while not negligible, does not justify the exception Qui-Gon is requesting. The attachment concerns us. The lateness concerns us. A brief pause. We decline to accept you into the initiate program." The room was very still. Anakin looked at the floor for 2 seconds, the right amount of time for a child absorbing a disappointment, then back up. "I understand," he said. It came out steadier than he intended. He saw Mace register the steadiness. He filed that away. Qui-Gon's voice behind him was carefully without inflection. "The Council's position is noted. I would ask that you consider the unusual nature of his origin." "Noted, Qui-Gon," we said. Yoda replied. "Sufficient, that word is." In the corridor outside, Qui-Gon walked without speaking for a full hallway length before he stopped and turned and looked at Anakin with an expression that carried, under its Jedi equilibrium, the very specific texture of a man who was angry on someone else's behalf and had nowhere to put it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I believed they would." "It's fine," Anakin said. "It isn't." "Master Qui-Gon," he said it quietly and without emphasis, the way you say something to interrupt without starting an argument. "I didn't come here to be accepted by a council." Qui-Gon looked at him. The look lasted longer than comfortable. "Why did you come here?" he asked. And the question was gentle and careful, and the kind of question only someone paying very close attention could have formulated. Anakin held the look and felt the narrowing, and felt, beneath it, the enormous patience of a man who had already lived to the end of one story and come back specifically to write a different one. "To learn from you," he said. "If you'll still have me." Another long pause. A temple window threw its diagonal bar of light across the floor between them, and Qui-Gon stood in it without appearing to notice, and the dust motes moved the way dust motes do in old, quiet buildings, which is to say, entirely indifferent to everything. "Yes," Qui-Gon said at last, "I'll still have you." Anakin nodded once. Then he turned and walked ahead, the correct distance behind where a Padawan would walk, and he kept his face forward, and in the private architecture of himself, behind the narrowing, he let himself exhale the council's dismissal like smoke. Good, he thought. Nobody. Still nobody. Exactly as planned. The Chancellor's office smelled like ambition and old wood. Anakin catalogued it the way he catalogued every room he entered now. Exits, sight lines, the position of anyone whose hands he couldn't see, and then arranged his face into the expression of a boy encountering grandeur for the first time, which required almost no construction because the office was genuinely grand in the way that things built to impress people who already have power tend to be, overbuilt, slightly airless, calculated down to the grain of the imported hardwood desk. Palpatine stood at the viewport with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged into the particular configuration of warmth he deployed for private audiences. Open, attentive, the eyes slightly soft at the corners, the posture of a man with all the time in the galaxy and no greater priority than the person in front of him. It was a performance of extraordinary technical quality. Anakin had spent years inside the version of that warmth directed at his own younger self, had believed it completely, had structured 45 years of catastrophic choices around the belief. And watching it now from outside and behind and below, from the perspective of a child the performance was not yet aimed at, he understood something he hadn't before. It cost Palpatine nothing to do this. The warmth was not effort, it was simply another language he was fluent in, the way some people are fluent in cruelty without thinking of it as skill. That was, in its way, more frightening than malice. Qui-Gon had brought him. The phrasing was deliberate, not taken him, not presented him, but brought him the way you bring someone to a conversation they might find useful. Low stakes, no ceremony. A courtesy call. The Chancellor had expressed interest in meeting Qui-Gon's ward after the Trade Federation hearings, where Qui-Gon had testified and Anakin had sat 2 rows back in the public gallery and watched Palpatine perform concern for the Senate's benefit with the same technical fluency he was now performing warmth. Anakin had, in that gallery, kept himself so thoroughly narrowed that he was fairly certain the cushioned seat beside him registered more force presence than he did. "So," Palpatine said, turning from the viewport with the unhurried ease of a man who knew that turning from viewports dramatically was a skill like any other. His gaze moved across Anakin with the speed and precision of an instrument's check. "This is the boy, Anakin Skywalker," Qui-Gon said. "My ward, as of 3 weeks ago. And the council?" Palpatine's voice carried the exact inflection of a man asking a question he already knew the answer to, which Anakin recognized as one of Palpatine's most useful tools. Asking questions to communicate that he knew things, rather than to learn them. "Declined to admit him," Qui-Gon said evenly. "Ah." The syllable was a small masterpiece of performed sympathy. Palpatine looked at Anakin with the softened eyes. "I'm sorry, my boy. That must have been difficult." "I understood their reasoning," Anakin said. A fractional pause. Palpatine's gaze adjusted, the same sharpening that Mace had produced, but faster, more refined, and immediately smoothed over. He crossed to the desk and rested one hand on its surface in the posture of a man settling in for a real conversation. "Unusual," he said, "for a child to understand a tribunal's reasoning." "I'm not sure I'm a typical child," Anakin said. Qui-Gon, standing slightly behind and to the left, produced a very small sound that might have been a cough. Palpatine asked him questions for 14 minutes. They were good questions, better than the Council's in some ways, because the Council had been conducting an assessment and Palpatine was conducting something more interesting, which was an excavation. He wanted to know what Anakin wanted, what he feared, what he thought about the Jedi, about the Senate, about the Trade Federation, about justice in the abstract and its relationship to power in the specific. The questions were framed as curiosity and operated as probing. Anakin answered each one from the perspective of a 9-year-old of unusual intelligence, and kept every answer one layer shallower than his actual position. He agreed where agreement was safe, deflected where it wasn't, and occasionally asked a question back, a child's technique, guileless seeming which Palpatine appeared to find charming and which Anakin used precisely because it was charming, which meant it was disarming, which meant it was useful. At the 12-minute mark, something changed in Palpatine's eyes. It wasn't dramatic. It was the visual equivalent of a door closing. The warmth remained in the architecture of the face, while the thing animating the warmth quietly withdrew. Anakin had seen this expression before from the opposite direction, the direction of someone who had just been assessed and found either promising or insufficient. He kept his own face open and slightly wondering, and waited. "Tell me, Anakin," Palpatine said, with the air of a man moving from pleasantry to the actual subject. What do you feel your strongest quality is, in yourself? It was the question designed to surface ego. In his other life, at 9 years old, he had answered it in some form that had landed correctly, had opened a door, had begun something. He knew this. He also knew that the right answer now was an answer that closed the door politely from the inside, without appearing to close it. Patience, he said. A beat. Patience, Palpatine repeated. Yes, sir, Watto, my former master. He said I was too patient, that I'd wait too long to act on things. A small, deliberately self-deprecating shrug. I don't know if that's true, but I think if I have a quality, it's that I can wait. Palpatine looked at him for 3 full seconds without expression. Then the warmth returned, and with it something that might have been, underneath, the faintest and most carefully managed shade of disappointment. A valuable quality, he said. Underrated in young people. Thank you, sir. On the way out, in the antechamber, while an aide guided them back toward the corridor, Palpatine stopped at the threshold and addressed Qui-Gon with the specific casual ease of an afterthought that had been planned. Master Jinn, you trained under Count Dooku, did you not? His lineage runs through yours. I've been meaning to request a meeting with the Count about the Senate's Judicial Reform Committee. I wonder if you might facilitate an introduction. I can pass the request through the appropriate channels, Qui-Gon said. Wonderful. Palpatine's gaze moved once more to Anakin, brief, conclusive, the look of a man closing a ledger. A pleasure, my boy. I'm sure we'll speak again, though perhaps a small, gracious smile, in less formal circumstances. I'd like that, Anakin said. He meant it in a way that people mean things they have no intention of allowing to happen. Outside in the Senate district corridor, in the moving crowd of aides and bureaucrats and the occasional security droid doing its slow rectangle of patrol, Qui-Gon walked 2 paces before he said, quietly, Patience. Anakin said. That was your answer. It was an honest answer. Qui-Gon was quiet for a moment. He was looking for something else. I know, Anakin said. Another pause, longer. A speeder passed overhead and threw a brief shadow across the walkway and moved on. Qui-Gon had the quality, in these moments, of a man doing arithmetic on a problem he hadn't finished formulating yet, the patience of a genuinely curious intelligence that refused to arrive at conclusions before it had the components. You're not what I expected, Qui-Gon said at last, and the words had the texture of something admitted rather than offered. What did you expect? Honestly, something louder. Anakin looked up at him and permitted himself a real expression, not performed, not calibrated, just the face of someone who found something genuinely, quietly funny. I used to be, he said. Qui-Gon looked at him with the eyes of a man who had just heard something true that he did not yet have the context to understand. He didn't push. That was the thing about Qui-Gon Jinn that no account had ever quite captured. The man's most extraordinary quality was not his sensitivity to the Force, or his technical mastery, or his stubborn institutional irritating independence. It was his willingness to sit with a mystery and not immediately try to solve it. He simply nodded and walked and let the answer be enough. Behind them, through the high windows of the Senate district, the Chancellor's office caught the afternoon light and held it. Gold on old wood, warmth without heat. The look of something that had learned to appear generous while accumulating everything it touched. Anakin did not look back. He never did, if he could help it. The sparring hall on the temple's 4th level smelled like sweat and focus, which Anakin had always thought were the same smell approached from different directions. He arrived early. He arrived early to everything now, not from anxiety but from the same instinct that made him catalog exits, the understanding that rooms revealed themselves differently when they were empty than when they were full, and that the difference was useful. At the 6th hour, the hall held only the sound of the ventilation system and the faint, rhythmic impact of someone practicing kata alone in the far corner. A Padawan 2 years older than his body, whose name he had not yet learned, and whose form was technically correct and spiritually absent. The movements of someone going through the required repetitions without the animating quality that made repetition into something else. He found a practice mat near the center and began stretching with the thoroughness of someone who understood what muscles were for, and waited. Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived at the 7th hour with his hair still damp from the morning wash and a datapad tucked under one arm, and the expression of a man who had agreed to something while underestimating what agreeing would require. Qui-Gon had arranged this. The phrasing used had been supplementary instruction. Obi-Wan had been knighted 2 months prior, after the Battle of Naboo, after Qui-Gon had taken a Zabrak's blade through the shoulder on the Theed generator catwalk, and Obi-Wan had finished what his master had started. The knighthood had come through in the field, the Council's confirmation arriving by encrypted transmission, while Qui-Gon was still in the Naboo medical facility arguing with the healers about the definition of bed rest. The relationship between them had shifted in the way relationships shifted when one person nearly died and the other had done something permanent in the process of preventing it. Not worse, but different. Rearranged into a new configuration neither had fully named yet. Qui-Gon had then taken Anakin as his ward and asked Obi-Wan, quietly, to supplement the boy's instruction. The Council had approved it as a mentorship arrangement. Nothing formal, simply a newly knighted practitioner making himself available to a ward in an irregular situation. Anakin had listened to the arrangement being described and had said thank you, and had meant it in layers that he suspected Qui-Gon partially heard and did not pursue. Obi-Wan at 22 was a different organism than Obi-Wan at any later age, in ways that were difficult to summarize without sounding unkind. He was excellent, technically precise, disciplined, possessed of a genuine ethical seriousness that the later years would sand into something more measured, but was currently in youth close to the surface. He was also uncertain in the specific way of someone who had recently been handed responsibility he wasn't sure he'd earned, and this uncertainty made him thorough in the way that uncertain people are thorough, compensating through preparation for the confidence he hadn't finished building. He was, Anakin thought, watching him set the datapad down and survey the hall, exactly as young as he looked. "Anakin," Obi-Wan said. "Master Kenobi," Anakin said. "Please don't call me that." "Obi-Wan," Anakin said. They began with assessment. Obi-Wan ran him through basic drills, the form-eye sequences that initiates learned in their first years, simple footwork, guard positions, the foundational vocabulary of lightsaber combat that preceded style, and preceded strategy, and preceded everything interesting about the discipline. Anakin performed them with the capability of a talented, slightly older than usual beginner. He clipped the third position, he was slow on the recovery from the second guard. He was genuinely, correctly good at the footwork, because footwork was the kind of thing a boy who had grown up navigating a crowded junk shop in bare feet would be good at. And staying true to the story meant staying true to what the story's circumstances would actually produce. "Your footwork is natural," Obi-Wan said, with the cautious approval of an instructor who had been told to expect something remarkable and was being careful not to overpraise averageness. "The upper guard needs work." "I know," Anakin said. "My arms are still." He gestured at them with the mild resignation of someone living in a child's proportions. "Yes, well, they won't be forever." Obi-Wan tilted his head. Again from the second position. The difficult moment arrived, as difficult moments tended to, without announcing itself. They were working the fifth drill when another pair of Padawans entered the hall. Initiates, 11 or 12 years old, assigned to free practice. They set up 2 mats down and began running combat sequences. And Anakin tracked them with the unfocused peripheral attention he kept on every occupied space, and then one of them threw a strike that the other one didn't see coming, and the one who didn't see it flinched, hard, and went down on one knee. And the impact was loud enough that Obi-Wan turned to look. The one on the ground was fine. He was up in 3 seconds, already laughing. But 3 seconds was long enough for the impact and the flinch to move through Anakin's awareness like a current. And the current touched something, and the something produced a heat spike behind the narrowing that he felt as a physical sensation in his back teeth. Sharp, immediate, gone in under a second. He exhaled it sideways. He had done this 10,000 times. He was very practiced at this. But Obi-Wan had turned back around, and Obi-Wan was looking at him with the specific quality of attention that Anakin recognized as involuntary, the look of someone who had felt something without knowing they'd felt it, the way you register a sound that's already stopped before you can identify it. "All right," Obi-Wan said. "Fine," Anakin said. "Ready." Obi-Wan held the look for 1 beat longer than the question required, then let it go. They continued. Afterward, they sat on the edge of the mat, and Obi-Wan poured water from a flask and handed it over without ceremony, and for a few minutes there was just the sound of the ventilation and the distant repetitions of the Padawan in the corner, who was still going, through the same kata with the same spiritual absence, admirable in its persistence if nothing else. "Can I ask you something?" Anakin said. Yes, Obi-Wan said with the wariness of someone agreeing before knowing the terms. Do you think the council was right to decline? A pause. Obi-Wan looked at the far wall with the expression of a man taking the question seriously, which Anakin appreciated. I think, Obi-Wan said carefully, that the council applies consistent standards, because consistent standards are what make an institution trustworthy. I also think that consistent standards occasionally produce outcomes that feel wrong in the specific case, and that the tension between those two things is not a problem to be solved. It's simply a condition of operating inside a structure larger than any individual judgment. He paused. That's a very diplomatic non-answer, I realize. No, Anakin said. It's an honest one. You think they were wrong. Obi-Wan looked at him sideways. I think, he said slower, that Qui-Gon's instincts are not often wrong. And I think there is something about you that doesn't add up in a way I can't precisely identify, which is either evidence that you're remarkable or evidence that I've let Qui-Gon's certainty color my perception. A small pause, probably some of both. Anakin drank his water and said nothing, and the silence was not uncomfortable. You're very calm, Obi-Wan said, with the air of someone describing a symptom they haven't diagnosed. You sound like that concerns you. Children are not usually this calm. No, Anakin agreed. They aren't. Another pause, longer. Obi-Wan opened his mouth, closed it, made a small decision visible in the set of his jaw, and said, Were you always this calm, on Tatooine? Anakin considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, and answered it with a version of the truth that was the size and shape of the truth, but not the substance of it. I learned, he said, that being calm was the most useful thing I could be. When you don't have a lot of power over your circumstances, being calm is the only kind of control. Obi-Wan received this. The receiving took a moment. That, he said at last, is either the most psychologically mature thing I've heard a 9-year-old say, or you have been speaking to too many Jedi in a very short time. Could be both, Anakin said. The corner of Obi-Wan's mouth moved. It was almost the same almost smile that Qui-Gon had produced in the transport viewport, and Anakin felt something shift in his chest at the similarity. The specific ache of recognizing a resemblance between a man and the teacher who made him, knowing what it cost to make it. He filed the feeling carefully behind the narrowing where it belonged. Same time tomorrow? Obi-Wan said, standing, collecting the datapad. Yes, Anakin said. Work on the upper guard tonight, against a wall if you have to. The form doesn't care about context. It just wants repetition. I know, Anakin said, and the I know came out slightly too settled, slightly too immediate, and he watched Obi-Wan notice it and file it in the same place he'd filed everything else. The drawer of things that didn't quite fit, that he was too careful to throw away and too uncertain to examine yet. Obi-Wan left. The Padawan in the corner was still going. The ventilation moved the air in its slow institutional circuit. Anakin sat for a moment longer in the empty middle of the mat, 9 years old in body, something else entirely in the silence behind his eyes, and thought about how long it had been since anyone had told him that form didn't care about context. Only repetition, he thought. Yes, exactly. You have no idea how long I've been repeating. Padmé came to Coruscant in the 3rd month of Anakin's residency at the temple, as part of a diplomatic delegation that had something to do with the ongoing Trade Federation reparations negotiation, and everything to do with the fact that Senator Palpatine had requested her presence specifically, a detail Anakin noted and stored and did not act on yet. He learned she was in the city the way he learned most things now, not through the Force, not through any channel that could be traced back to unusual awareness, but through the ordinary accumulation of small information. An aide mentioning the Naboo delegation to Qui-Gon in a corridor, Qui-Gon mentioning it to Anakin that evening with the mild, unloaded quality of someone passing along news rather than intelligence. Anakin had said "oh" and gone back to the coupling relay he was recalibrating, and waited until Qui-Gon left the room before he sat very still for approximately 45 seconds. Then he went back to the coupling relay. They met again at a Senate reception he attended as Qui-Gon's ward. These events happened periodically, the temple maintaining its political relationships through the social currency of presence, and Anakin had learned to move through them with the quiet usefulness of someone who could carry a tray, remember names, and make senators feel attended to without making them feel managed. He was good at this. He had, in another life, been catastrophically bad at it, which had cost him most of his political relationships and contributed materially to a series of institutional failures he preferred not to enumerate. The improvement was purchased. He saw her across the room before she saw him, which gave him the advantage of managing his own face before management became necessary. She was talking to a Rhodian trade attaché with the focused, slightly effortful attention of someone who found the conversation professionally necessary and personally tedious, and she was doing it with enough grace that only someone specifically looking for the effort would find it. He got himself a glass of something carbonated from a passing tray and moved to a position that was plausibly near the refreshments table and waited. "Anakin Skywalker," she said, when the Rhodian had moved on and she had turned and found him approximately 2 meters to her left, looking at a wall hanging with the expression of a child who had run out of adult conversation. "Your Highness," he said, then correcting, "Senator, I'm sorry. It's a recent change. You're forgiven." She crossed to him with the directness that was, he had always thought, her most characteristic quality. She did not approach obliquely, did not use social distance as negotiating space the way many politicians did. She came straight at the thing she was interested in, which was efficient and occasionally alarming. "You're here with Master Qui-Gon?" "His ward." "Yes." She looked at him with the alert, assessing quality that he remembered and that he now experienced from a different angle, not as the object of the assessment, but as someone watching a mind work. She was 14 years old, 5 years older than his body, an age gap that in this context produced nothing more complicated than the social distance between a child and a young adult, and he was grateful for the simplicity of that. And she carried herself with the specific quality of someone who had been handed real authority young enough that it had become load-bearing rather than decorative. "How is Coruscant treating you?" she asked. "Cold," he said, "and very tall." Something in her face relaxed, not into warmth exactly, but into the terrain just before warmth, the region where professional composure and genuine response occupied the same expression. "It gets less tall," she said. "You stop looking up eventually. That seems like a loss." She studied him. "You're not quite what I expected. From a 9-year-old. People keep saying that," Anakin said. "Does it bother you?" "No," he said, which was true. "It's useful." She laughed. A real one, short and unguarded, and the sound of it did the thing it had always done, which was to arrive somewhere behind the narrowing where he couldn't fully manage it. He let it arrive. He had decided, in the early weeks of this second life, that there were certain things he was not going to deny himself feeling, because the alternative was the kind of interior sterility that had contributed as much to his first life's catastrophe as anything external. He felt it. He kept it behind the narrowing. He moved on. "Useful?" she repeated. "You sound like a politician." "I grew up in a junk shop," he said. "Politicians and mechanics think the same way. You look at what you have, you figure out what it can do, you don't waste anything." They talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than he'd intended and exactly as long as he'd wanted. She asked about his training and he told her about the sparring sessions with Obi-Wan, and described the upper guard problem with enough genuine self-deprecation to be plausible. She told him about the reparations negotiation in terms that carefully omitted the specific figures and positions while communicating the shape of what was at stake. And he understood that this was not withholding information from a child, but simply professional habit. She would have communicated at the same level of precision to anyone in a social context who hadn't been briefed. He told her about his mother. This was calculated only in the sense that everything was calculated. He would have told her regardless, because it was the truth, and because speaking it to her specifically had always been easier than speaking it to most people, even now, even across the distance of who they currently were to each other. He told her that Shmi was still on Tatooine, and that the Trade Reparations Fund that Naboo had established in the wake of the blockade had created a mechanism for slave purchase petitions that he was, quietly, through Qui-Gon, trying to navigate. Padmé's expression, when he said this, went through several things in rapid succession, and settled on something he recognized as the look she wore when she had decided to act on something. "There are provisions," she said carefully, "in the secondary clause of the reparations framework. Humanitarian carve-outs. I can't make promises, but I can." She stopped herself, restarted. "I can look at whether the petition pathway has been correctly implemented on the Tatooine registry end, bureaucratically, as a matter of normal oversight." "I would appreciate that," Anakin said. "Very much." She nodded once, which was the Padmé Amidala equivalent of a signed agreement. He walked back toward Qui-Gon through the reception crowd afterward, and found the Jedi Master in conversation with a Syrian senator, and waited at a respectful distance, and thought about what had just happened with the careful, deliberate attention of someone conducting an honest accounting. He had not pursued her. He had not attempted to be impressive. He had been present and honest, and had allowed the conversation to go where it went, without engineering the destination, and the result had been 40 minutes of something that felt, underneath all its appropriate social scaffolding, like being known by someone, partially imperfectly across a contextual gap, but known. The specific relief of that was something he had not expected, and did not know what to do with. In his other life, love had been a thing he held so tightly it became a wound. He had loved her the way a drowning man loved a fixed point, not wrongly, and desperation had made the love into something that needed her to be a certain way, needed her to stay, needed her to be the proof that all of it was worth the cost. He understood now that this was not love's failure. It was fear wearing love's face, and he had not known the difference because no one had taught him to look for it. He was not going to do that again. He was going to let this be what it was, a conversation at a reception, a girl who was 5 years older than his body, and had no business being anything to him yet. A small warmth that he was not going to clutch at or categorize or press into service as evidence of anything. He was going to let it exist at its actual size. That was the plan. He was committed to the plan. He was also, he acknowledged privately, going to think about the sound of her laugh for approximately the next 3 days, and this was the tax the plan levied, and he would pay it. Across the reception hall, Palpatine moved between conversations with the frictionless ease of a current no one had named yet, and his gaze passed over Anakin once, the brief, conclusive assessment of a man reconfirming a prior judgment, and moved on to Padmé, where it stayed a beat longer, warmer, more deliberate. Anakin watched this from the distance of Qui-Gon's orbit and felt the narrowing hold steady and thought, I see you looking at her. I know what the looking means. I know where the looking leads if nothing interrupts it. He turned his attention back to Qui-Gon's conversation with the Syrian senator and contributed a small, appropriate observation about trade route security that made the senator laugh. Something, he thought, with the patience of a man who had waited longer for harder things, will interrupt it. War arrived the way it always did, not as a single catastrophic moment, but as a series of smaller failures that accumulated until the weight of them became indistinguishable from inevitability. Anakin had watched it coming for 6 years. He had watched Dooku's disillusionment deepen and be cultivated, had watched Palpatine's Senate maneuvering carve out the emergency powers provision with the patient precision of a man who had been planning the carving for decades, had watched the clone army's existence surface like something that had always been there, waiting to be found. He had said nothing that couldn't be said by a Jedi Knight of unremarkable record who had pieced it together through ordinary channels. He had positioned himself where he needed to be. He had waited. He was 22 years old in body now. He had been waiting, in one form or another, for 17 years. The Outer Rim campaign assigned him to command a forward battle group of the 501st Legion. Several thousand men who wore his face, not his current face, but the face of the person he had been. Jango Fett's architecture reproduced in long rows of identical bone structure, and deliver a briefing with the calm authority of a Jedi officer who had read about war in books. He did this. He delivered the briefing. He looked at their faces and kept the narrowing so tight it was nearly painful and thought, in the private space behind it, about names. He knew names. He knew Sergeant Apo and Commander Rex and a dozen others who would, if history ran its course, stand in temple corridors with weapons raised, and the knowing of this sat inside him like swallowed glass, present, sharp, unable to be acknowledged. Rex briefed him on the Christophsis situation with the direct, economical style of someone who had learned that officers fell into 2 categories, those who wanted information and those who wanted performance, and had decided the general in front of him wanted information. He was correct. Anakin absorbed the briefing and asked 2 questions that demonstrated tactical awareness, and 1 question that was slightly wrong in a way a newly deployed general could plausibly be wrong, and Rex answered it without expression, and they understood each other. General, Rex said at the end. Commander, Anakin said. That was enough. It was exactly enough. He had always loved that about soldiers, the economy of it, the way trust was established through competence and consistency, rather than performed warmth, the handshake of professionals who understood what the work required. Geonosis was first, then Christophsis, then Teth, and the Ryloth campaign, and 6 months of the Outer Rim that moved with the grinding, attritional quality of a war being prosecuted by two sides who both believed they were winning, and neither of whom was wrong yet. He was careful on the battlefield in a way that cost him sleep. The care was not cowardice. He moved through combat with the old soul precision of a man who had fought this war before and knew its geometry, knew which cover held and which didn't, knew the specific sound a droid's targeting system made when it was leading rather than tracking. The care was about calibration. He needed to be good enough to keep his men alive and unremarkable enough to remain unremarkable. And these two requirements were in constant, grinding negotiation. He won engagements. He won them by 4 or 5% more than a talented lucky general would win them, which was a margin small enough to attribute to good training and careful preparation, and the kind of instincts that experienced officers developed. He took territory, he held it. He lost men, not as many as other engagements lost, not in ways that made the difference statistically obvious, but enough to feel each one as what it was. He stood at the edge of a battlefield on Felucia, 6 months in the hour after a skirmish that had cost him 4 clones and gained him a secondary power relay station that would be destroyed by the Separatists. 2 weeks later, anyway, and he looked at the orange-lit sky through the massive fungal growth of the Felucian canopy and thought about nothing at all for approximately 90 seconds. That was his grief budget for the day. He had learned to work within it. The flicker happened on Umbara. He had known it would happen eventually. It was the built-in cost of what he was doing, the emotional debt accumulated by months of managed restraint, finding an unmanaged moment to collect. He had simply not been able to predict the specific circumstance, which, in retrospect, he should have anticipated, because the specific circumstance was the one he had never been fully able to armor against. A clone named CT-7567, Rex, who was not supposed to be on this particular forward line, but had positioned himself there anyway with the self-directed stubbornness that was Rex's single most reliable quality, took a bolt to the left shoulder that spun him off a ridge and into a drainage ditch 3 meters below. Anakin was 20 meters away. The bolt that hit Rex had been aimed at Anakin. Rex had moved without appearing to calculate the decision, the way people move when the decision is below the threshold of conscious choice. Anakin reached him in the ditch in under 4 seconds. Rex was alive. The shot had hit armor, the shoulder plate absorbing the worst of it, a bad burn beneath, but nothing structural. He was conscious and using words that the military's official communication logs would not be reproducing. "I'm fine," Rex said. "You're not," Anakin said. "I'm fine enough," Rex said, which was accurate in the way soldiers meant accuracy. Anakin got a hand under his arm, and the relief of it, the specific flooding relief of not this, not him, not today, moved through him before he could narrow it, and for half a second the thing behind the mask breathed outward. It lasted less than a second. He pulled it back with the practiced violence of someone slamming a shutter in a storm. But in that half second the air in the ditch did something. Rex couldn't have named it, couldn't have said what changed, but his eyes moved to Anakin's face with an expression that was not a battlefield expression, not the focused pragmatism of combat, but something quieter and much older. He said nothing. He looked at Anakin for 3 seconds in the orange half-dark of the Umbaran drainage ditch, and then he looked at the sky instead. "Hell of a shot," Rex said finally, meaning the enemy shot, meaning the miss, meaning nothing that could be directly addressed. "Yes," Anakin said. They did not discuss it. Rex did not mention it again. Not that day, not in the debrief, not in the 6 months following. He had filed it, Anakin suspected, in the same drawer Obi-Wan used. Things that didn't add up, kept because discarding them felt wrong, untouched because touching them would require a framework nobody had yet provided. Obi-Wan found him in the command tent that night. He had his own battalion now, 3 systems over, and had transferred in on a logistics shuttle ostensibly to coordinate the joint push toward the Umbaran capital. Actually because Obi-Wan Kenobi had developed over 12 years of supplementary instruction and occasional shared deployment to specific instinct for when Anakin needed to be found and did not always act on it, but had, tonight, decided to. He sat across the folding table, and they drank bad tea from field rations, and Obi-Wan said nothing for long enough that the tense ambient sound, wind, distant artillery at the theater's edge, a droid doing diagnostics somewhere nearby, took on the quality of a held note. "I saw something on the ridge today," Obi-Wan said. Visibility was poor. Anakin said, "Umbaran atmosphere scatters light." Obi-Wan said. He drank his tea. Anakin drank his. It was probably the atmosphere. Obi-Wan said. Probably. Anakin agreed. The tent fabric moved in the wind. Outside, someone was running a standard equipment check, the sounds of it moving through its sequence with the reliable rhythm of a thing that had been done many times and would be done many more. Obi-Wan looked at him across the table with the eyes of a man who had been paying attention for 12 years and had arrived at a number of conclusions he was not yet prepared to make into sentences. "How are you?" he asked. "Not how is the campaign. Not what's your read on the next push. Just, how are you?" Anakin wrapped both hands around the warm cup and looked at the table and told the truth in the only size it was safe to be. "Tired," he said. "Just a little longer. Just until they're not looking." Obi-Wan said nothing. He stayed until the 3rd hour, and then he left, and Anakin sat alone in the tent with the cold tea and the sound of the wind, and let the narrowing relax, just for a few seconds, in the privacy of the dark. The forged orders took 4 days to construct properly. Not because the forgery itself was difficult. He had learned document fabrication from a Coruscant slicer whose techniques Anakin had absorbed during his 3rd year of the Clone Wars, in the other life, during a period he preferred not to examine closely. The difficulty was plausibility architecture. A forged order that was technically perfect, but contextually wrong, would fail faster than a sloppy forgery that fit its environment. He needed the requisition to feel like something a mid-level logistics coordinator would generate on a tired afternoon, complete with the specific bureaucratic redundancies that real documents accumulated and fabricated ones usually omitted. He inserted 3 redundancies. He misdated one supporting authorization by 6 hours in the direction that suggested it had been processed during a shift change. He left a minor formatting inconsistency in the header that the 501st's administrative droid had been producing for 11 months, without anyone correcting it. Then he waited for a supply day, because the supply shuttle to Kamino ran on a cycle that aligned with the garrison rotation on Kamino's external docking ring, which changed crews at the 14th hour and created a 17-minute window during the handoff when the monitoring logs ran on the outgoing crew's authorization tokens and the incoming crew hadn't yet initialized their own. 17 minutes was more than enough. He had done harder things in less. Kamino from descent looked like a world that had given up on land as an idea and decided water was sufficient. The platform cities rose from the ocean on their pale stilts, like something a child had built from identical pieces, and the rain came sideways in sheets that the locals had apparently decided to simply accept rather than engineer around, because the engineering of the Kaminoans was directed entirely inward, toward the vats, the sequences, the infinitely patient work of reproduction at scale. He brought the shuttle in on an automated docking path that registered under the logistics coordinator's authorization he'd borrowed for the day, and walked out into the wet cold of a Kaminoan corridor with the gait of a man making a delivery. He was wearing non-regulation underarmor with the 501st markings removed, a logistics officer's outer layer, and a face that he had spent 22 years learning to keep unremarkable. He had left his lightsaber on the shuttle. He had thought about this decision for approximately 6 hours before making it, and had arrived at the same conclusion each time. The lightsaber was the most efficient tool for 11 categories of problem he might encounter in this facility, and it was also the most efficient way to transform a covert infiltration into an incident. He carried a data pad, a calibration tool that could be plausibly explained, and 17 years of compressed guilt. The aura cloak extended outward in a way that was different from the inward narrowing he sustained constantly. The narrowing was compression, taking up less space, making less noise, pressing himself small. What he was doing now was more active and considerably more expensive. A subtle, directional suggestion extended into the attention of every sensor droid and security station he passed. A soft pressure that said, "You have already checked this corridor," and that sound was the ventilation and the figure at the end of the passage as a logged maintenance worker. It was not mind control. It was closer to the way a background becomes background, the thing your eye slides off because nothing has told it to stop. He was making himself into background, and the cost of it was the specific interior heat of high-exertion force use conducted entirely without expression, the equivalent of moving very heavy objects while keeping your face in a resting state. By the 3rd corridor junction, he had a headache that started at the base of his skull and was working forward. He kept moving. The central cloning matrix was on the facility's 4th sublevel, behind a security partition that used 3 authentication layers, and one Kaminoan technician who was, at the 14th hour and 32 minutes, eating something at a desk that smelled like it was trying very hard to be food and not quite succeeding. Anakin walked past him in the corridor and suggested gently that the data terminal at the far end of the room needed attention. The technician looked up, looked at the terminal, looked at his food, and made the decision that the terminal could wait 4 minutes. Anakin went through the security partition during the 4 minutes and sat down at the primary matrix interface and began. The inhibitor chip programming was not hidden. This was the thing that made it both elegant and obscene. It wasn't concealed behind additional encryption or buried in a secondary system. It was simply present, labeled with the clinical terminology of a standard behavioral compliance protocol, the kind of language that made atrocity into paperwork. He had known it would look like this. He had not been prepared for how much it would cost him to see it laid out in plain notation, the trigger conditions listed with the same formatting as a maintenance schedule. Order 66 documented between Order 65 and Order 67, like something ordinary. He sat with this for a moment. He allowed himself the moment because denying it would have cost him more. Then he began the purge. He did not call it a deletion. He called it, in the private language of his own thinking, where no terminology was regulated, a correction, which was also not quite the right word, but was closer. He moved through the matrix methodically, working from the central trigger architecture outward through the branching instances, the way you remove something that has grown into a structure rather than simply sitting on it. He had to be careful not to disturb the surrounding behavioral programming, the clones' basic command responsiveness, their unit cohesion protocols, the medical monitoring subroutines, because disturbing those would create diagnostic flags that someone would investigate. He was 11 minutes in when the patrol footsteps came. He heard them at the corridor junction, a 2-person security droid configuration running a route that was not on the patrol schedule he had memorized, which meant either the schedule had been updated recently or this was a random insertion. And either way, it was going to arrive at the partition door in approximately 40 seconds. He kept working. He did not speed up. Speeding up introduced errors, and an incomplete purge was worse than no purge. He finished the tertiary branch sequence with 30 seconds remaining, moved to the final instance cluster, and completed the last 3 deletions as the patrol footsteps stopped outside the door. Silence. 12 seconds of it. He suggested, outward, gently, that the door had been checked on the previous pass. He suggested that the corridor was logged clear. He sat very still at the terminal and kept his breathing even and did not look at the door. The footsteps moved on. He closed the interface, stood up, and walked out through the partition with the unhurried pace of someone who had finished an uninteresting task. He took a different route back to the docking level and stopped once in a corridor that ran along the exterior wall, where the rain threw itself against the transparasteel in long gray curtains. Below him, through the floor-level windows that gave onto the sub-level catwalks, he could see into one of the growth chambers, rows of development tanks, each one holding a shape that was becoming a person, lit from below in pale blue, motionless and ongoing, and entirely unaware of what had just been removed from their future. He pressed one hand flat against the cold transparent steel and looked at them and said, in the silence of the corridor where no one was present and no record would be made, "Not this time. Not one of you. Not ever again." The words had no audience. That was fine. He had not said them for an audience. The shuttle lifted well within the window, the forged authorization logging a clean departure in the system that the logistics coordinator whose credentials he had borrowed would never look at because logistics coordinators had 37 other things requiring attention. At any given hour, he flew the first hour on autopilot with his eyes closed and his head against the seat back, and the force cloak released entirely, the narrowing returned to its baseline maintenance level, the headache making its slow exit through his temples. He felt the way he imagined a building might feel after its scaffolding was removed. Everything still standing, the structure proven, the supports no longer required. He thought about thousands of faces wearing the same face. He thought about a future that was no longer in those spines. He thought, nobody will ever know this happened. Not the clones, not the Council, not Obi-Wan, not Padmé, not Rex. Nobody. Good, he thought, and the word had a different quality now than it had in Watto's inventory. A different weight. This was not the satisfaction of concealment. This was older than satisfaction. Good, he thought. Now the rest. The doors to the Chancellor's office were unlocked. This was the detail that struck Anakin as he came down the corridor at a pace that was not quite running. The doors were unlocked and slightly ajar, which meant either the council members who had entered 11 minutes ago had not thought to secure them, or Palpatine had not wanted them secured, or some combination of both produced by a situation developing faster than anyone had planned for. He slowed to a walk at the final junction and composed his face into the expression of a Jedi Knight who had received a concerning encrypted signal from Master Windu and had arrived as quickly as protocol permitted. Which was true in the way that many things he said were true, accurate in its components, misleading in its architecture. He pushed the door open and went in. The room was wrong. Not subtly wrong, catastrophically, obviously, irrevocably wrong in the way that certain rooms became once violence had moved through them. 2 council members were down. Master Kolar against the far wall. Master Teen crumpled at the base of the viewport that looked out over the Coruscant skyline, the midday light coming through it with the indifference of light that does not concern itself with what it illuminates. Master Fisto was still standing, but barely. The particular quality of his stance communicated a man operating on the edge of what was possible, holding a guard position through will rather than reserve. Mace Windu was fighting. Anakin had seen Mace Windu fight twice, at a distance, in his previous life, and had understood both times that he was watching something technically singular. A Form 7 practitioner who had constructed the style's most dangerous expression from first principles. Vapad's ability to channel the darkness of a fight back against its source requiring a specific kind of interior territory that most Jedi were wise enough not to develop. What he was watching now was Mace at the edge of his own capacity, holding, pushing, the purple blade moving in tight, controlled responses to a barrage of red that came from the bent-robed figure in the center of the room. Palpatine moved like something that had been pretending to be human for so long that abandoning the pretense was a physical relief. The controlled patrician posture replaced by something lower, faster, the face no longer arranged into any expression at all, simply present, concentrated, the face of a man whose work was killing and who was currently at work. He was winning. Not dramatically, not yet, but Mace's footwork had the character of managed retreat, each position slightly less advantageous than the last, the geometry of the room slowly becoming Palpatine's geometry. Anakin stood in the doorway and held the observation for 2 full seconds. Then Palpatine's gaze moved to him. It was the same gaze from the reception hall, from the Chancellor's office 14 years ago, from the Senate gallery and the diplomatic functions, and every room they had occupied in proximity over the course of a war that Palpatine had authored, and Anakin had spent fighting carefully. The assessing gaze, the instrument check, the rapid evaluation that had, every single time, arrived at the same conclusion and moved on. It arrived at the conclusion now. The face did what it always did, a small, almost imperceptible dismissal, the kind that didn't require a full expression, just a quality of attention withdrawing. Palpatine managed it even now, even in combat, the social reflex so deeply installed it operated without consulting the rest of him. "Ah," he said. He did not lower the red blade. He did not stop the pressure on Mace's guard. He did it all as a subordinate process, while the primary process of his attention remained on the man who was actually threatening him. Master Jinn's old responsibility, wasn't it? "Run along, boy. This doesn't concern you." The words were almost exactly what the outline of this moment had always promised they would be. Anakin stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind him. "You never did know how to look closely, Sidious." He said it quietly, not for effect. He had learned that effects announced themselves and the things that landed hardest arrived without announcement. He said it at a conversational register, the tone of a man making an observation he had been holding for a long time and had finally found the appropriate occasion to release. The name hit the room differently than any other word he could have chosen. Mace's blade held. Master Fisto's guard shifted fractionally. The 2 bodies near the wall remained still, and the light from the viewport continued its indifferent work, and the only thing in the room that changed substantially was Palpatine's face. Not dramatically, not the theatrical villain's recoil that less precise writers would reach for. It was smaller than that and worse, a single, fractional interruption in the continuous forward momentum of a man who had not experienced interruption in a very long time, a pause that the body produced before the mind could prevent it. Palpatine's eyes moved across Anakin with a quality of attention that had not been present in any previous assessment. Not the instrument check, not the dismissal, but something that arrived from deeper in the mechanism, something that recognized, suddenly, that it was looking at a variable it had not accounted for. "Night Skywalker," he said, and the warmth was gone now, stripped entirely by circumstance, the voice beneath it older and colder and careful. "You have no idea what you are interrupting." "I know exactly what I'm interrupting," Anakin said. He took 3 steps into the room, not fast, not slow, the pace of someone who had made a decision and was implementing it without drama. "I've known for 19 years. Another pause. This one the length of a breath. "That's not possible," Palpatine said. "Which part?" Mace Windu used the pause. He was a tactician before anything else, and the pause was an opening, and he moved into it with the controlled aggression of a man reclaiming lost ground. A rapid 2-step advance. A bind that pushed Palpatine's blade wide, and suddenly the geometry of the room was different. Suddenly Palpatine was not managing 2 fronts, but 3, with Anakin completing the triangle from the doorway, and Fisto recovering from the far side. Palpatine reassessed. Anakin watched him do it, the rapid, brilliant recalculation of someone reading a changed board, and saw the moment the calculation landed. Saw it in the specific stillness of a man who had, perhaps for the first time in decades, found himself uncertain of the outcome. "You've been concealed," Palpatine said. It was not quite a question. The voice had changed again, all professional distance now, the warmth and the coldness both gone, leaving something that might have been, in another context, in another man, the beginning of respect. "Yes," Anakin said. "For how long?" "Since the blood test," Anakin said. "Since Watto's inventory. Since the needle." A silence occupied the room. Mace maintained his position. Fisto held. The light came through the viewport. Somewhere in the building's deep infrastructure, the ventilation system continued its work, indifferent. Palpatine's face underwent a series of very small changes that Anakin watched with the attention of someone who had waited 19 years to see them. Calculation, reassessment, a rapid traversal of 19 years of interactions, 19 years of dismissals, 19 years of Master Jinn's old responsibility and run-along boy, recontextualizing all of it against this new information. "The midi-chlorian count," Palpatine said slowly, "suppressed, every day, since I was 9 years old." Anakin held his gaze across the room. "You had a test. The test told you what I needed it to tell you. You believed the test because you always believe instruments over instinct. That's the Sith in you, everything reducible to a reading, a number, a measurable quantity." Palpatine's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "And Qui-Gon suspected something, never knew what. He was a man who trusted mystery more than most. A beat. I'm glad he lived to see this." The words landed flat and true, and Palpatine received them with the expression of someone who does not know what to do with truth when it arrives without tactical purpose. The room held its configuration. 3 Jedi, 1 Sith Lord, the dead and the recovering arranged around the edges of a moment that had not yet resolved. Anakin stood in his position of the triangle and felt the narrowing. 19 years of it, the constant geological pressure, the held breath. The lamp turned low, and let himself feel for the first time that it was almost over. Almost. He looked at Palpatine across the space between them and saw something he had not expected. Not rage, not calculation, not the cold confidence of the most powerful Sith in a millennium. He saw, briefly and nakedly, the expression of a man who had built an entire architecture of reality on a specific foundation and had just been shown that the foundation was false. It lasted 1 second, then Palpatine's face closed. "You're still a Padawan playing at strategy," he said. "Whatever you think you've arranged." Anakin reached for his belt. The room went still in the way that rooms go still when everyone present understands that the next thing that happens will not be undone. He let go, not of the lightsaber, that came after. First, he let go of 19 years of compression, 19 years of the narrowing held tight as a fist, 19 years of cellular dampening and aura dimming, and the constant geological effort of being nobody in a body built to be everything. He released it the way you release a breath you have held so long you have forgotten breathing was once involuntary. It left him like a tide going out, except tides went quietly, and this did not. The windows of the Chancellor's office hummed first, a low, subsonic register that Anakin felt in his back teeth before he heard it, the transparent steel vibrating against its seals, as something passed through the room that had no polite name in any scientific register. The dust on the desk surface, old wood, imported, carefully maintained, lifted in a single, slow curtain and hung suspended for a half-second before it understood what gravity required of it. The temperature did not drop so much as the warmth left, pulled inward toward the center of the room, toward Anakin, as though heat itself was attending. Every person present staggered. Mace Windu took one step sideways and caught himself on a chairback and did not let go of it immediately. Master Fisto dropped to one knee, not wounded, not struck, simply pressed down by something his body registered as weight without being able to name the source. The two surviving council members who had entered this room believing they understood the upper limit of what a force-sensitive human being could produce stood against the wall and did not move, and did not speak. Palpatine made a sound. It was small. It was the sound of a man whose body has received information that contradicts everything the mind has built on top of it. Not a scream, not a word. Simply the involuntary acoustic product of a system encountering a variable outside its design parameters. The red lightsaber in his hand did not waver, because Palpatine's control over his own instrument was absolute, and did not consult his feelings. But his face was open in a way it had not been open since. Anakin suspected the man had been young enough for his face to be something other than a tool. Naked, that was the word. Palpatine's face was naked. "That's not possible," Palpatine said. His voice had lost its registers, not the warmth, which had been gone since the name, but the cold as well, the professional distance, leaving something hoarse and unsteady that the man wearing it did not appear to recognize as his own. "The reading was average. I made sure of that," Anakin said. "Every day, for 19 years. Just for this moment." He ignited his lightsaber. The blue of it looked different in the charged air of the room. Not brighter exactly, but more present, more insistent, the way colors look after long rain. He held it at his side in the low guard of a man who is not in a hurry, because hurry implies uncertainty about the outcome. Palpatine's eyes moved across him with a quality of assessment that was now entirely different from every prior assessment. Not the dismissal, not the instrument check, but the look of a man who has spent decades as the most dangerous thing in every room, and has just, for the first time, looked across a room and understood that the room has changed. He threw lightning. It came the way it always came from Palpatine, not as a gesture, but as a decision, immediate and total, both hands forward. The full reserve of a Sith Lord who had never once in his adult life needed to consider resource management in a fight, because no fight had ever lasted long enough to require it. The arc of it crossed the room in a single white instant, and Anakin caught it in his open left hand. Not the blade, his hand. He felt it arrive, the voltage, the intention, the specific quality of Palpatine's power which was always, underneath its technical sophistication, about dominance. And he absorbed it the way the ground absorbs rain, without drama, without display, simply taking it in and holding it and letting it dissipate through him into nothing. He stood in the white, crackling silence of caught lightning and looked at Palpatine and waited for the recognition to finish its work. It finished. "No," Palpatine said, and the word was not defiance. It was arithmetic. A man who had built his entire life on the careful calculation of power differentials arriving at a calculation he could not make come out correctly. Anakin moved. The crossing of the room took perhaps 2 seconds. He did not use speed as performance. The point of it was not to be fast. The point of it was to be done, to complete the thing that needed completing with the minimum of ceremony that the situation required, and no more. He moved in the gemso form he had been practicing since he was old enough to practice anything, the style his body had grown back into over 19 years of maintenance, the muscle memory of an entire life rebuilt in a younger frame. Palpatine met him. 3 exchanges, not the extended operatic engagement that the Sith Lord's mythology deserved, or that the moment's narrative weight might seem to demand. 3 exchanges, fast, precise. The collision of a technique perfected across 80 combined years, against a technique that had simply run out of the context in which it was unbeatable. Palpatine's Form 7 relied on its wielder's ability to dominate the emotional temperature of a fight, to feed on the opponent's darkness, and return it amplified. Anakin gave him nothing to feed on. There was no darkness in the room from Anakin's direction, only the settled, clear, unhurried resolution of a man completing work he had been preparing for longer than Palpatine had been Sidious. The first exchange established distance. The second removed the red lightsaber from the conversation. The third put Palpatine against the wall beside the viewport, pressed there not by brutality, but by the simple geometric inevitability of what happened when skill met its ceiling. And Anakin held the blue blade at the line of his throat and looked at him. Palpatine was breathing hard. This was, Anakin suspected, an experience the man had not had in 50 years. "You could have been," Palpatine began. "I was," Anakin said. "I was everything you wanted me to be, in another life. I know exactly what I could have been. That's why I'm here." He did not let Palpatine finish the sentence. He was not cruel about it. He simply ended it cleanly, with the resolve of a man who understood that mercy toward the galaxy and mercy toward its destroyer were not the same category of decision, and had made his peace with the distinction a long time ago. He stood over what remained and said to the room, to the light coming through the viewport, to nobody in particular, "For everyone you would have burned, rest if you even remember how." The council members did not speak immediately. This was appropriate. Some moments require their full duration before language becomes possible, and Anakin gave the room its duration, extinguishing the blade and standing in the ordinary coruscant light as the humming in the windows gradually resolved back into silence, and the dust resettled and the temperature remembered itself. Mace Windu was the first to find words. He found them in the wrong order twice before he found them correctly, which Anakin found, privately warmly, the most human thing he had ever seen Mace Windu do. "Skywalker," Mace said finally. How long?" "Long enough," Anakin said. Master Fisto, from the floor where he was still collecting himself, produced a sound that was almost a laugh. It died before it fully arrived, but it had been there. Obi-Wan came through the doors at a run 12 minutes later. He had been in the building, drawn by the disturbance in the Force, the way a tuning fork was drawn by a note it recognized, and stopped in the doorway and looked at the room, and looked at Anakin, and went through several expressions in rapid succession before arriving at the one that fit. "I knew it," he said. "You suspected it," Anakin said. "Umbara," Obi-Wan said. "And the 7th sparring session, and honestly the way you flew during the Ryloth campaign was deeply suspicious. You could have said something. I thought I was imagining it." He crossed the room and stood in front of Anakin with the look of a man who has just had 19 years of arithmetic resolve into a single correct answer and is not sure whether to be relieved or annoyed. "Your luck was too good," he said. "I told Qui-Gon once that no one was that lucky." "What did he say?" Obi-Wan's expression moved into something softer. "He said some people weren't lucky, they were just paying very close attention." A pause. "He was right, as usual. Infuriating man. Yes," Anakin said, "he is." He handed his lightsaber to Master Yoda at the 17th hour, in the small council anteroom, where Qui-Gon had once waited with a 9-year-old boy, and the silence had held the quality of a room deciding something. He handed it over with both hands, and without ceremony, and said that he was requesting to leave the Order not as penance, not as exile, but as a choice freely made by a man who had done the specific thing he came back to do, and was ready to be something other than a weapon. Yoda held the lightsaber for a long moment. His ears were lowered. "Earned, this is," Yoda said. "Earned in ways the archives will never hold." He looked up. "Go well, Anakin Skywalker." "Thank you, Master," Anakin said. It was the first time he had called him that. It was the right time. Shmi was waiting on the steps outside, with Padmé beside her, and the Coruscant sun, that thin, high-altitude sun that was never quite warm enough but was present, consistently, reliably present, came down on all of them without distinction. His mother turned when she heard the doors, and her face did the thing it had always done, and that he had spent 2 lifetimes memorizing and never tired of. Padmé stood slightly behind her with her hands folded, and her composure intact, and her eyes doing the thing they did when something had reached past the composure and taken up residence anyway. He walked down the steps toward them and did not hurry, and did not perform the calm. It was simply his. The galaxy would remember the Chancellor's assassin as a mystery, a myth, a ghost. Anakin Skywalker would remember it as simply a Tuesday. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, that was enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.